Section 6 of Ancient Ideals in Modern Life, 4 lectures. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Ancient Ideals in Modern Life, 4 lectures by Annie Besant. The Caste System, Lecture 3, Part 1. My brothers, we are to study tonight that characteristic system of caste which we find in India from the very earliest days of the Aryan civilization, which has persisted in its form down to the present time, and which is probably the chief reason for the stability of Indian society. In studying this system we shall proceed along the same lines that we have hitherto followed. First we shall look at it in its state of perfection, then we shall see it as it has degenerated until it reached its present position. Then we shall consider whether any changes are practicable which should restore it to its former usefulness and glory, and deprive it of the many disadvantages and mischiefs at present connected with it. Any subject that deals with the social life of a people needs very careful consideration, and suggestions of the introduction of any changes must be made with the greatest caution, with the greatest deliberation. Therefore, in dealing with the latter part of this subject, I shall put before you tentatively certain propositions which may serve at least as the basis for discussion, even if not accepted in the form in which they are originally presented. It seems to me necessary in dealing with a point of this kind, and with all questions like this, that we should distinguish very clearly between that which is essential and that which is non-essential. That is, we must divide our subject into those parts which are vital, those parts which are permanent, and the parts which are non-essential, which are temporary, which do not spring out of the original principles, but have to do with the more modern conditions, accretions that have grown up around the system, and which by no means are essential to its vitality, but rather detrimental to its life. Now, as regards the original idea of the caste system, it is laid down exceedingly carefully and clearly among many other passages in the Bhagavad Gita, 4th Discourse. Here Sri Krishna himself says, "The 4 castes were emanated from me by the different distribution of energies and actions. Know me to be the author of them." That is a distinct declaration from the lips of Sri Krishna himself as to the origin of the system. He puts himself forward as the author, and he states that the division rests on certain fundamental principles in nature, and follows a certain distribution of qualities or energies and actions. We find, if we take the terms there used, that it is the distribution of the gunas and the karmas that determine castes. These are the essential fundamental qualities in nature, and the actions arising from them which cause certain inevitable results. On these 2 things the 4 castes, he declares, are based. They are not, according to this, arbitrary distinctions. They are not, according to this, artificial creations of society. They are fundamental natural divisions based on differences of materials, based on resulting differences of actions. Such is declared by the mouth of the great teacher to be the foundation of the 4 castes. In many other passages we find the same idea worked out. Some of the great teachers give certain qualities as characteristic of each of the 4 castes. Some go so far as to say that if these qualities do not exist in a man born in any particular caste, he is not really a member of that caste. To take a case from the Mahabharata, reciting the qualities belonging to a Brahmana and the qualities belonging to a Shudra, the teacher declared, quote, "If these qualities are seen in a Shudra and are not found in a Brahmana, then the Shudra is not a Shudra, nor is that Brahmana a Brahmana." End quote. So we see that this view of the system is put forward, that there are certain fundamental differences in nature, and the caste system, being based on these, should show out the same characteristic differences. If we study the system carefully, we shall find that these 4 castes present the path of evolution along which a human soul develops. We shall find, in fact, that these fundamental divisions are by no means peculiar to Hinduism, are not only to be found in India, but that they are universal in their nature. They are recognizable over the whole of the countries of the world. The difference that we see between India and the other states of the West is simply this, that in the Hindu system these differences are recognized, and society is definitely organized on their basis, while in the other countries these differences are not definitely recognized, and the social order is not connected with them. Where you get a system in which these differences are recognized and the social order is based upon them, it is spoken of as a system of castes. Where you have a society without this recognition, but where the qualities assert themselves in spite of the ignoring of them, we speak of a system of classes. But the lines are easy to be seen and may be definitely recognized, and you find in all past civilizations as well as in the present civilization the same lines of cleavage, the same natural fundamental distinctions. Now, in the definite recognition of these lines of cleavage, there is a distinct social value. It tends towards the stability of society. It tends to contentment, to the absence of continual competition and strife, and it makes society orderly and progressive at the same time. It is not without significance that in one of the social utopias which have been sketched in the West, we find a system of society outlined by the great French philosopher Auguste Comte, whose philosophy is now called the positive philosophy, and who founded on that philosophy the reorganization of society. It is not without significance that the caste system is there definitively revived, and the characteristic marks imprinted on it by Hindu sages are found reappearing in this latest offspring of Western politico-social thought. We have there a well-organized priestly class, on the lines of the caste of the Brahmanas. I have not time to tell you the details of that system, of which one note is the mystical one of organizing in sevens, but it is important that the man at the head of that class is to appoint one of his fellow priests as his successor, so that the authority is always from above and never from below. The whole control over commerce is to be in a class corresponding to that which we here call the Vaishya caste, great capitalists who organize labor, and again in a separate body we have the proletariat, representing the Shudra caste. The only caste that does not appear in this utopia is the Kshatriya, because the whole of this system is based on the supposition that society will be peaceful. There being an absence of war, there's no need for a military class. We have thus a definite caste system, re-established on purely scientific lines, and the motto of the positive society is order with progress. This is the same fundamental notion as we have in connection with the great Indian system of caste. The next thing to remember is that this system, as regards the soul, is a great educative system. Reincarnation is always implied in it. The soul passes from one caste to another according to the qualities it has developed, according to the actions it has performed. It may rise upwards or it may sink downwards, but always the effect of one birth shows itself in another birth, and the soul is led stage by stage along the pathway of evolution. And very plainly is this shown when you look upon the caste system in its pure form. The higher the caste, the greater the restrictions, the heavier the duties, the more burdensome the weight of responsibility placed on its shoulders. This system in its original form was not a system of rights claimed by a caste, but a system of duties imposed on a caste. The higher the caste, the heavier the duties. As you study it, you find that the easiest life, the life with the least responsibility, with the least difficulty, with the least restriction, was the life of a member of the lowest caste and not of the highest. As a man rose from one caste to another, as the soul grew older and stronger, he was made to resign more and more. Every restriction that was put upon a man was put on him in order to make him of greater service, and not to minister to his vanity or pride. If the Brahmana were surrounded with respect, it was on his shoulders that lay the burden of renunciation and sacrifice, of poverty and learning. All these restrictions were not made that he might be separated from the people and pride himself on his separateness, but that he might be kept pure as a channel through which divine life might flow to the people. And a man could only pass into that caste when he had learned the lesson of sacrifice, when he had learned to serve as a Shudra, when he had learned to give and be charitable as a Vaishya, when he had learned to sacrifice life itself as a Kshatriya. Then, when he had become a lover of asceticism and learning, then was he permitted to pass into the order of Brahmanas, to give himself to the people as their teacher, counselor, and guide. That was the original idea of the system, that the kind of way in which the system worked. It is well that you should be aware in connection with it that a certain definite type of subtle body belonged to each caste. According to the qualities we read, the castes were emanated, but the qualities were expressed in the subtle invisible bodies, and the type of each caste is marked in the nature of the invisible bodies that belong to it. The Suksma Sarira, the subtle body, was different in the four castes, was built up according to the qualities of each special caste, so that 4 types of Sukshma Shariras belonged to the 4 castes, and the qualities were expressed in appropriate organisms and had each their appropriate vehicle in which they could manifest. What then was the part which heredity played in this system? Heredity was the obvious, necessary way of providing suitable physical bodies to suit each type of subtle bodies in which the qualities were manifested. It was necessary to build up by physical heredity the kind of physical body which should answer to the type of the invisible body, and so heredity became a necessary part of this system, in order that the physical body might be suited to the subtle body, that the whole of the man might be consistent, and that there might not be incongruity between the subtle and the gross vehicles. How enormous was the difficulty of changing from one caste to another, you may estimate by the famous and well-known case of Vishvamitra. If you realize this difference of bodies, then you will be able to understand why it was so difficult for a man to pass from one caste to another. Vishvamitra, having been born in the Kshatriya caste with the Sukshma Sharira of the Kshatriya, and the physical body fitted by Kshatriya heredity to serve in correspondence with that subtle body, it was by no means an easy thing for him to change from the caste of Kshatriyas into the caste of Brahmanas. It needed, you may remember, a process of yoga prolonged through an enormous number of years in order to make the necessary changes in those bodies which might render the transition possible. It was not a thing of a day or a month or a year. It was not that a man should merely show the qualities of the higher order, but it was only definite yogic practices prolonged through enormous periods of time by which changes were made in the type, which rendered it possible for the gods to greet him with the title of Brahmarshi. Looking backwards, we cannot but recognize these fundamental types, these great lines of cleavage, and the place of heredity as an essential part of the system in the well-organized arrangement of the whole. A man who did not perform the dharma of his caste, and thus made a discord between the invisible and visible bodies, was in the old days outcasted, and thus the purity of caste was maintained. Thus suitable physical bodies were continually produced by heredity, and pure heredity was protected by outcasting. Thus studying, we begin to see how and why this system was formed, and how and why it has given to Indian society such remarkable stability. Further than this, we may notice that from a true Hindu standpoint, one particular life in a body was not regarded of such great importance as it is now generally regarded in modern India. A man who by his past was born in a body of a particular caste did not look upon that as a matter of such vital import as people are inclined to do in these degenerate days. The man took the karma of his body with perfect cheerfulness, knew it was only for a short time, was content to accept it for that time and to build for himself a better body in the future, if he found that in the past he had built a body which was unsatisfactory to him. You find a man in any order willingly taking up the duties of that order and discharging them with contentment and recognizing his place in the commonwealth. If I wanted to give an example, I might take the very speaker of Bhagavad Gita, Sri Krishna himself, who having chosen to be born in the caste of a Kshatriya because that was the best body for the work which was to be done, never dreamed of asserting his own inner superiority, his own divine nature, but willingly bowed down and washed the feet of Brahmanas, showing an example which was due from the body which he had chosen to take, and which was appropriate to the situation which he held in life. I say that in order that this old view may be before you in its various aspects, and that you may realize how in those days, when the spiritual laws were better understood, the castes worked without rebellion or discontent on the part of any member, however great or low his position, for it was recognized that all souls passed through all castes in turn, that if a man was born in a low caste today, he had only to evolve a higher nature in order to be born in a higher caste thereafter. Men did not look on birth as a matter of chance, but as a matter of law, and they accepted the working of the good law and conformed themselves to its provisions. Gradually, however, a change arose. This system, originally founded and worked by great rishis, The different castes inhabited by souls of strongly marked and different characteristics worked well enough in those days, but as less and less developed souls were born into the system, their qualities no longer coincided with the special caste into which they were born. Less and less evolved souls came into Indian bodies for training and instruction and were no longer able to fulfill the dharma of the caste in which they were born. Then began the time of the multiplication of castes and the subdivisions of the original four great orders. Men who could not show out the qualities which in themselves would win the respect generally due to their caste began inventing artificial barriers by which they might separate themselves from others. Not showing out any difference in the soul, they laid more and more stress on social and personal advantages. They built up wall after wall. They built up distinction after distinction to extort respect where their qualities did not naturally win it, and so introduced artificial distinctions which were not present in nature and had no basis in the facts of life. Then there grew up these endless subdivisions which are the great and very baneful characteristics of the caste system in the modern days. Hundreds upon hundreds of subcastes effacing the original order, hundreds of subcastes blurring all the natural lines and resting on unreal, unnatural, purely artificial foundations, increased in their number by vanity and pride, continually multiplied by the spirit of exclusiveness, as men lost sight of the unity of the self and forgot that the four castes were the four ways of expressing his qualities. Thus multiplied by this spirit of difference and separateness, the number of subcastes and subdivisions grew more and more. Exclusiveness grew up in the heart. A man prided himself on the particular subdivision in which he was born, and put out his brothers, excluding them from his own subdivision, and ever striving to multiply distinctions, as separateness grew even more plainly marked. Hence we find today that the spirit of caste is essentially a spirit of exclusiveness, a spirit of pride and vanity, of indifference to the feelings of others, of harshness and contempt towards those who are excluded from special privileges. We find in it an indifference to the feelings of those who are shut out, and instead of a man thinking that he was born a Brahmana in order that he should serve those around him, he prides himself on being a Brahmana in order to stand apart from them and above them, claiming for himself privileges and distinctions that they are not allowed to acquire. At the same time that this has been done, the dharma of the caste has been utterly neglected. That a man should be poor and learned, that used to be the glory of a Brahmana. But in modern days, that he should be rich and ignorant is generally his pride. Instead of finding the Brahmana versed in the Vedas, you find him pleading in the law courts and versed in the Western civilization. Can you wonder that when the dharma of the caste is thrown aside, the respect which was once shown to the caste should also at the same time disappear? Can you wonder that when a Brahmana has abandoned his duty, others should refuse to him the privileges that he still claims? When you cannot distinguish him by his qualities from the Shudra, why should he be treated with respect by the Shudra? Can you wonder that the Shudra should revolt against the superiority claimed but not manifested, against the privilege extorted instead of being gladly given to well-acknowledged merit? Where a Brahmana is found who is as he ought to be, learned, frugal, wise, pure in heart, all men are still willing to show him reverence, to bow down to him and recognize him as a leader and teacher. Men are not, as a rule, unwilling to recognize excellence. Men are sometimes but too ready to be led, too glad to be guided. The human heart is always seeking for someone to lead it, someone to teach it, someone to guide it. And how exceedingly strong is this yearning in humanity may be seen in the pitiful spectacle of crowds bowing down to sorry heroes and heroines not worthy of their respect, for lack of true heroes of the right kind. When we find in Indian society today continual complaints against Brahmanas, a feeling of anger, a feeling of jealousy, a feeling of envy, a desire to throw all castes aside, we should see in that the result of the fact that men are unreasonably demanding respect where others are unwilling to yield it, that men demand every privilege, forgetful of every duty, and that where privilege is grudgingly yielded, resentment grows up in the place of reverence and love. From time to time, it was as though the gods themselves protested against the growing degeneracy and falsehood of the system by sending some of the noblest souls to take birth in low-caste bodies, or even in those out of caste altogether. Thus several of the holiest and most revered saints in southern India wore the bodies of pariahs. Let us also remember in connection with this the distinction between the essential and the non-essential of which I spoke in the beginning. The essential is the great fourfold division, because this is founded in nature. The non-essential is the innumerable artificial subdivisions, chiefly founded on vanity and on the spirit of exclusiveness. Let us then separate in our thought the fourfold system of caste from the hundreds of subcastes that we see around us on all sides, and let us lay down as one possible line of improving the present system the recognition of the fourfold division only, and the gradual ignoring of those hundreds of subdivisions that have arisen. Now on this point, an authority worthy of all respect in the Orthodox Hindu community has spoken clearly and distinctly. In southern India there is at the head of one of the great maths one who holds the honored name of Sri Shankaracharya, a name which has come down as that of the head of that math from the time of the great teacher of Advaita, who is recognized as the man who stands as the head of the whole religious community and whose words are listened to with reverence by the whole body of the southern Hindus. Only a few years ago, speaking with all the weight of that authority, he declared that the Hindus should drop this modern system of subcastes, and that within the limit of each caste there should be intermarriage and interdining. All Brahmanas should be willing to intermarry with all Brahmanas and to interdine with all Brahmanas, and so with the other three castes. In recommending this change, I am therefore but repeating what has been suggested by one of the recognized orthodox authorities. This change is in no way detrimental to Hinduism, but is necessary to meet the conditions of modern days. It is not the four great divisions that raise so much antagonism, but these lines of artificial subdivision that separate man from man, and split the whole Indian community into small fragments and associations. These subdivisions go against the possibility of national spirit, against the growing up of social unity. They make it almost impossible to weld the people into one, for where a community is divided into innumerable parts, all possibility of national and social unity disappears. End of section 6, read by Sandra, near Montreal, 2022.